Ashes in the pan, a time will tell production. The sun was dropping low behind the sharp teeth of the Sierra Nevada when I finally reined in my buckskin mare, Sage. We'd been pushing hard for near 3 weeks, and both of us were bone-tired. I slid down from the saddle and let her drink from the narrow creek that cut through the little hollow. My name's Rhett McFall, and I was a long way from any place that might call itself civilized. I'd spent years wearing the sky blue of the United States Army. They gave me an honorable discharge when my time was up, but everybody knew they was glad to be rid of me. Too much mouth, not enough patience for fools with bars on their shoulders. After they cut me loose, I drifted. Ended up riding with a crew that took what they wanted. Banks, stages, a parole or two. We was good at it for a while. Then came the job that broke everything. We hit a stage running the Sacramento Road. Silas, Tate, Zeb, and me. It should have been clean. But Tate and Zeb got mean with it. There was a woman and her little boy inside the coach. Tate started roughing her up for the jewelry she was wearing, and when the boy tried to stop him, Zeb backhanded the child hard enough to knock him senseless. I told them to quit. They didn't. I had to pull Tate off her myself. Silas just sat his horse and watched like it was entertainment. After that night, I knew I couldn't ride with him no more. We split ways ugly. A month later the marshals caught up to me outside Placerville. They had me dead to rights. Rope around my neck and a choice to make. I gave them 3 names. Silas Crow, Tate Wilkins, and Zeb Calder. I told myself it was justice for that woman and her boy. Truth was, I just didn't want to hang. Now them same 3 was hunting me. I built a small fire and sat with my back against a pine, watching the water sparkle in the last light. This land weren't claimed by nobody yet. Perfect place to disappear for a while. I'd been panning the creek for 3 days and already had a small pouch of color. Not enough to make a man rich, but enough to give a fella ideas about starting over. My mother's father had been a soldier once, back in China. An officer in the Emperor's army before he sailed across the ocean and ended up in the States. He taught me things about fighting that no drill sergeant ever showed a recruit. How to move, how to breathe, how to let a bigger man beat himself. Most soldiers I served with fought like brawlers. I fought different. I sipped bitter coffee and stared into the flames. Maybe I could stay here long enough to scrape together a real stake. Maybe I could head down into the valley, claim a piece of ground, and build something that didn't have blood on it. But deep down I knew better. Men like me don't get to walk away clean. Not when there's men out there who want blood for blood. The next few days passed quiet-like, almost peaceful. I spent my mornings knee-deep in that icy creek, swirling a shallow pan through the gravel, watching for any flash of yellow. Most days I found nothing but black sand and broken dreams, but on the 4th morning, my heart near stopped. There it was, a thin, bright streak of color laying in the bottom of my pan like a promise. Gold. Real gold. Not much, mind you, but enough to tell me I'd found the right spot. My hands shook as I worked the pan again and again. By the time the sun sat high, I had a small pouch filling up with tiny flakes and a couple decent nuggets. I couldn't help but grin like a fool. Maybe this was my shot. Maybe I could scrape enough color out of this creek to buy myself a new life somewhere far away from my old sins. That evening, I was sitting by my fire roasting a rabbit I'd snared when Sage suddenly threw her head up and snorted, ears pricked toward the tree line. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming danger. Then I heard it, the crunch of horse shoes on dry pine needles. More than one horse. I stayed low, heart hammering against my ribs. Slowly, I reached for my gear as 3 riders broke through the brush into the clearing. The firelight caught their faces, and my stomach turned to ice. I knew every last one of them. The tallest one, a scar-faced bastard named Silas Crow, smiled down at me with all the warmth of a rattlesnake. "Well now," he drawled, cocking his pistol, "look what the devil dragged in. We've been looking for you a long time, McFall. Time to settle up for all that talking you did." I didn't give them the chance to get settled. The moment I heard horses pushing through the brush and hooves crunching pine needles, I rolled behind my log and brought my Mississippi rifle up smooth. The big .54 caliber roared. Silas Crow, riding point on his big gray, took the heavy ball dead center in the chest. He slumped forward in the saddle, then slid sideways and hit the ground hard, his horse rearing in panic. Gunfire ripped through the clearing like a thunderstorm. Bullets slammed into the log, sending splinters flying. One caught me high in the left arm, a burnin' through and through that made my vision spark white. I dropped the empty rifle and drew my Colt Patterson, thumbing the hammer as I moved low. Tate came riding in hard from the right, leanin' low in the saddle and firin' wild. I fanned 3 shots. The third one caught his horse in the neck. The animal screamed and went down, throwing Tate hard into the dirt. He came up cussin', pistol still in hand. Zeb, the massive brute, kicked his mount straight at me like a cavalry charge. I put my last 2 rounds into the horse's chest. It stumbled and crashed, pinning Zeb's leg for a second before he wrenched himself free. Now it was down to knives and what my granddad taught me. My mother's father had been a captain in the Emperor's Banner Army back in China, a hard man who'd fought bandits, pirates, and foreign soldiers before sailing to America. He raised me after Pa died, drilling me in the old ways every morning and every night. How to read a man's weight. How to turn anger into weakness. How to fight calm when everyone else was losing their head. Zeb came at me like a wounded bear, knife out, roaring. I slipped inside his wild swing, caught his wrist, and drove my elbow into his jaw. He staggered but didn't drop. Tate was circling now, looking for an opening. I used Zeb's body as a shield, then shoved him hard into Tate. They collided, giving me the half-second I needed. My Bowie knife came out clean. I slashed low across Zeb's thigh, opening him up. He howled and swung again. I ducked, stepped in close, and drove the blade up under his ribs just like Granddad showed me, twisting as I pulled it free. Zeb's eyes went wide. He grabbed at me, then collapsed. Tate screamed and charged. I met him head-on. He was faster than he looked, but he fought angry. I parried his knife, trapped his arm, and slammed my forehead into his face twice. On the third, I buried my Bowie in his gut and let him drop. The clearin' fell deathly quiet except for the nervous horses and my own ragged breathing. 3 men I'd once called brothers lay dead around me. Blood soaked my sleeve and the dirt at my feet. The arm wound was pouring now. I'd won the fight, but the price felt heavier than any gold I'd ever pan. The fire had burned down to nothing, but coals by the time the trembling in my hands finally eased. I looked at the 3 bodies lying there in the dirt and felt a sickness roll through me that had nothing to do with the blood. These men weren't strangers. They were the only friends I had left in this world. Men I'd laughed with, rode with, trusted with my life. And I'd sold them out to save my own skin. Tonight I'd finished the job. The weight of it sat heavy in my chest, like a stone I'd be carrying the rest of my days. My left arm was throbbing something awful. The bullet had punched clean through the meat of my upper arm, a through-and-through flesh wound. It was still leaking steady. I knew what had to be done. I heated the blade of my Bowie knife in the fire until the steel glowed cherry red. Gritting my teeth, I pressed the flat of the hot blade against both holes. The smell of burning flesh filled the air as I cauterized the wound. The pain was so fierce I nearly passed out, but I held it there until the bleeding stopped. Once it cooled, I tore up a clean shirt, packed the wound with moss, and wrapped it tight with strips of cloth. There was no law out here in these wild hills. Nobody was coming. The only ones who knew I was here were now lying cold on the ground. I stared into the dying fire and made myself a promise. I was done running. I'd take the gold I'd found, pack up what was left of my gear, and head west out of these mountains, down toward the big valley where a man could still claim a piece of land and build something real. Maybe near Sutter's Fort, where folks were starting to put down roots. A small farm, a cabin, something that belonged to me. For the first time in years, I let myself believe I might actually have a future. Dawn found me still sitting by the cold ashes of last night's fire. My arm ached like fire, but the bleeding had finally stopped. I buried the 3 men I once called friends under a stand of tall pines, marking the graves with simple stones. No names, just 3 mounds of dirt that would slowly disappear back into the mountains. I spent the rest of that day panning the creek one last time. By the time the sun began to set, I had a small leather pouch heavy with gold dust and a handful of nuggets. It weren't a fortune, but it was enough to give a man a start. I packed up my camp, loaded everything onto Sage, and mounted up. Before I rode out, I took one last look at that little hollow that had almost become my grave. The creek still sang its same quiet song, but I knew I'd never come back to this place. The trail west was long and hard on a bad arm, but I kept moving. After 8 days of slow riding, the mountains finally gave way to the wide, open Sacramento Valley. The land here was rich and green, with room enough for a man to breathe. Near the banks of the American Sacramento River, I found a stretch of unclaimed bottom land with good water and fertile soil. I drove my stakes into the ground that same afternoon. It's been 3 months now. I've got a small cabin raised and a few acres cleared. Most days I work from sunup to sundown, building fences, planting crops, and trying to become the kind of man my granddad would have been proud of. Some nights I still dream about those 3 graves up in the Sierra. I still wake up with the taste of guilt in my mouth. But every morning I step outside, look at the land I'm building, and I remember why I fought so hard to stay alive. This time, I ain't running from nothing. This time, I'm staying.